Hello and welcome to Unsourced Wall. My name is Elvis, and as always, I am your host. Alright, so we have a really packed session today. Let's start off with probably one of the most interesting casting decisions I've heard in a while. Jamie Foxx is set to play the lead in the new Spawn movie written by Todd McFarlane, produced by Blumhouse. Apparently, according to Todd, this has been in the works for years, that he and Jamie had met to discuss making a Spawn film, but that never came about. And so when he finally started getting traction moving with Blumhouse to write this new reboot, he thought of Jamie and they got this really set down. Apparently, Spawn won't be in the movie that much. It's going to be focusing more on either Sam and Twitch or analogs to Sam and Twitch, those detectives that find their way in and out of the Spawn universe from time to time. They even had their own series by Brian Michael Bendis. So that's interesting. I mean, I can understand that if they had Jamie Foxx as the lead completely throughout the movie, it might break the bank slightly on Blumhouse's stance on low budgets. Apparently, they have a very tight limit at $5 million per movie, just so that it keeps budgets low and increases revenue. Jamie Foxx not being in the lead, but also being a big enough name that it gets all these headlines, all this traction, all this good PR, is a solid move, I have to say. And it's interesting to see how they'll handle that together. Another way more astounding casting decision that's been made in a comic book movie is Dave Bautista in the Body Bags movie, written by Kyle Ward, who also wrote John Wick Chapter 2. Body Bags is a comic that is, I don't want to say notorious, but it's also weird, just from base premise. And I'm gonna try to explain this in the least horrifying way I can. It's a very gratuitous looking comic. It doesn't shy away from the excesses of form. The basic premise is hitman, bounty hunter, maybe even serial killer who is reunited with his estranged daughter, and they go on adventures together. But the twist is that the daughter is incredibly young. At most, 13. And the art style is not equivalent to that at all, and it's just very weird. And I can't see how someone would take that and look at that and see, we can make a movie out of it. You have to pretty much go an entirely different way visually just to get away from the horrifying and terrible implications that comic brings up. Incredibly off-putting. Let's leave it at that. But it's interesting. I think that's crazy that Batista, who is pretty hot right now, for choosing pretty well-known franchises to latch on to. I'm thinking more about Spectre, where he plays the henchman in that movie, and was sort of promoted a bit as being a throwback to classic henchmen for Bond films, to be attached to this kind of project with such a background. But I mean, it worked for Wanted, right? The movie's going to be called Dogtown, and, well, I guess we'll see how they work any of that into something that's palatable. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't be shocked to see a Bomb Queen movie. And if you haven't heard of Bomb Queen, please don't Google it. It will ruin your day for quite a while. It's just not good. Moving on to comic news, there was this short period where a very persuasive and impacting rumor was going about that Stuart Immonen, who you might know from his work on Spider-Man, Next Wave, and Empress, that he was retiring from comics after Amazing Spider-Man number 800 came out, which apparently everyone took as fact, and we saw a lot of comic luminaries and contemporaries going about saying how much they will miss the guy, how much they love his work, how much his work has impacted the industry, how much of a legacy he's going to leave behind, how they've stood this test of time. Only for it to turn out that Stuart Immonen is not retiring. That was just probably a miscommunication. The source of his retirement was his inker. And from what I can gather, the miscommunication is that Stuart isn't retiring, but he has no real further plans, and that he probably does plan on retiring sometime in the future, much later than now, though. But it was really nice to see all this outpouring of emotion for this creator. He really is one of the best. And one of the most heartwarming things that I heard was how so many people felt like they needed to congratulate and really respect the fact that Stuart had chosen to retire on his own accord, rather than be forced out or lowballed or even just discarded by the comic industry. So that was really great to see. Even if he's not retiring, the camaraderie and the bonds that these people have created together and a much more emotional side to comics as we know it, really. For our last bit of comic news, though, is maybe the most outlandish thing I've ever heard. We all know that Rob Liefeld is no stranger to his own reputation. There are so many jokes that he has heard, that he's repeated, and that he completely embraces. It's much of a case that he loves the fact that people are talking about him. Whenever he comes up in interviews and in clips of just things that he posts online, he very much comes off as the kind of person who loves that people are talking about him no matter what they might be saying. So he totally leans into it. And one of the most humorous examples of this was a recent sketch he did. They posted on his Twitter of a character he created called The Pouch, which is this military sort of soldier who is created of nothing but pouches. Arms for pouches, knuckles for pouches, completely covered in head to toe in pouches, or things are completely substituted for pouches, including a helmet. Which is funny in of itself. It didn't need to go farther than that. But Liefeld apparently has gone the extra mile. And this character will actually be introduced in Michelle Thief's Bloodstrike run called Bloodstrike Brutalis, which will only last, I think, 3 or 4 issues. I know that he's only on it for a short stint of time, but everyone that I've talked to about it is really anticipating it because Michelle Thief, when he's working, I think, a bit more loosely, like with his own creator-owned work, which is a love letter to Suicide Squad from the 80s, called Copra, then there's a lot more that he can really tap into creatively. That's simply what I think. And going back to the Image well and the Image founders and their works isn't something that's unknown to him even. He was part of this project called Twisted Savage Dragon Funnies that took stabs at Eric Larson's Savage Dragon comic. So that's something that he's well aware of and that he's had experience with him. So I'm excited for Bloodstrike. Way more excited than Youngblood, which I've completely fallen out of already. But to go back to The Pouch, the one thing that really does put me off a little bit is how much better the initial sketch from Liefeld was to the actual official cover that The Pouch is on, especially to the little details, because the little details on that sketch are actually really interesting and clever than the sort of face front joke that The Pouch is on the actual cover. Perhaps the most blatant example of this is how on the sketch, The Pouch's helmet is obviously a pouch, but it's retrofitted to work as a helmet. The pouch flap is much more narrow and rides down the head, giving it more of an aesthetic look to it than just being just a slapped on square pouch that it is with just no real flair to it on the cover. And that's something that I feel is lost in translation. So who really knows how it's going to end up looking when all is said and done? I'm excited, and I'm going to pick that up right when it comes out. So moving on to what I read this week, and the answer is not a lot, and especially not anything that I've been reading for the last 3 weeks. I'm talking about No Justice. I haven't read the last issue. I have no concerns about reading that last issue. I just do not care. I realize I have the CBR right here. I have it on my desktop. I just really can't get it up to even start clicking through this thing. The first 3 issues were really boring. They had little nice jokes and gags, but other than that, it's nothing I want to get into. I will be, however, looking into Snyder's Justice League run. I'm going to go straight forward into that blind to whatever No Justice was pushing out in this last issue. So that's a miss for me. But in terms of DC as a whole, there are actually some things I did read from them. Mainly the Hanna-Barbera and DC crossovers from this maybe second or third wave. I've lost track because they've been really putting these things out at a rapid fire pace, which is interesting. And I'm glad to see that they still have some faith in this line of books they've been doing. The ones that really did interest me were Flash, Speed Buggy, and Aquaman Jabberjaw. Now, the Aquaman Jabberjaw one is perhaps one of the most eclectic and insanely written comics I read in recent times. It really strides that line between something that's clever or insanely blunt, but it works either way. There are some insane lines that I can't believe were actually put down on paper and printed just because of how on the nose they were. that just brings a smile to my face. It's very much like the Ultimate FF run I was talking about a few weeks ago, where Dr. Doom calls Ultimate Spider-Ham a swine, and then Ultimate Spider-Ham says that's racist. It's very much on that level of, oh wow, you're really doing that, and you're actually making these analogies and these connections between ridiculous things and ridiculous aspects of your own universe. So I really enjoyed it just for that. I thought that was fantastic. The second Hanna-Barbera crossover I read was Flash Speed Buggy, because it's those two by Scott Lobdell, and I expected fantastic things. Now, I know saying Scott Lobdell isn't like the highest of praises, but I think he does really good works on tie-ins and one-shots, so this was absolutely no different. It is probably the favorite one I read so far because it is just so hilarious. Unlike Aquaman's crossover, which was still funny, this one was a lot more focused and a lot more consistent with its jokes and where the gags were coming from, that it just felt like a good read all on its own. There are some fantastic little jokes here and there. You have Speed Buggy, you have things like Reverse Speed Buggy, and I think Bizarro Speed Buggy type amalgamation. I don't know. I never really seen the Speed Buggy cartoons. I don't know if these are real characters or if that Bizarro one was a actual character or villain from that show. But it's just a hilarious little book, and it's pretty heartwarming too. It really is in a shocking surprise turn of events, and this has an epilogue to it that really hammers home like, oh wow, I can't believe these two characters worked, and I love their dynamic and want to see more stories from them. But as we all know, that's probably never going to happen. So it's nice just to get both this issue, the epilogue, and a nice round out little story about how these two met and formed a little friendship. Speed Buggy is in. He's the new Bold, alright, in The Brave and the Bold. There were two other Hanna-Barbera crossovers this week that I didn't get a chance to read. I probably will, just on how good these two were. Honestly, I really enjoyed them, so I can't wait to get into these two. And they were Black Lightning Hong Kong Phooey and the Super Sons meet Dynamite. So I expect good things out of them and from the Hanna-Barbera line as it's moving forward. I know it's had some misfires like Wacky Raceland and the Jetsons, which didn't really do much and felt like a lot of wasted potential, but it stayed at a pretty high level overall. Now, the penultimate thing I read was the second issue of the Jeepers Creepers tie-in by Mark Andreyko over at Dynamite. I know in my first episode, the test run, I praised the first issue quite a bit, honestly. It really did come as a shock that Mark Andreyko was working on this series and that it had a sensible hook, sensibly written characters, and a plot that seemed to be going places. And this second issue stays with that a lot. It definitely settles down my concerns about whether or not we're going to be seeing the origin of the Creeper in this form and using the hints that they seeded in the first issue. And it pretty much says, yeah, we're doing that. So I'm glad that it's going straight forward for it. Like I said, I don't think they're ever going to make a fourth movie to tie up this whole series. So it's nice just to have this story and being written quite capably. I enjoy it. I mean, congrats to Mark Andreyko. I'll be continuing to pull this series for how long it goes, and hopefully it ties up pretty well. Last of all has to be Stray Bullets, number 35 from Image. Now, this has probably got to be one of the most insane issues since the last issue, which I already noted was pretty incredibly out there and weird, because both continue to tell the character-centered story of one of the villains of this arc's little brother, who has major schizophrenic and reality displacement issues. So we're seeing it, both these issues, from his perspective, and it is just incredibly outlandish and really hard to keep straight. Now, this issue does go back to that earlier solicit that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, where it said that we'd be delving into more of his process and what he thinks these visions and hallucinations are coming from, and how that was apparently supposed to tie into the future vision he had been given when he was first introduced of arcs and characters that are farther along in the franchise's timeline. So this continues that story, and it's the story that promised about him thinking that they're from aliens and government experiments and all that kind of thing. But it doesn't go back to that specific little future vision he had. So that's still up in the air. I'm still wondering if Lapham is going to just redraw those panels from that issue when it finally gets collected. But the issue as a whole is really entertaining. This insane character and just how he influences and throws a wrench into the already chaotic Stray Bullets narrative is entirely enjoyable, entertaining. I don't know where this series has been going. Now, my main prediction right now is that it's going to end at number 40, this story arc. That's 5 issues from now. And with what the character ends up doing, there's no way. I have no idea when a series is going to end again. It could be 48 now, honestly. Just because of what he does and the giant mess he makes of already spinning wheels. And that's what I love about this series. That's what I love about this arc. I know it's gone on for so long and it's dragged in places really noticeably, but it can still really shock me and make me excited about what the hell Lapham is going to end up doing. Where can this go and what creative bullshit is he going to pull out to make it get there? So yeah, I had a really good time reading this week, despite not getting to some stuff that I found was boring or stuff that now I'm really even more sold on. Unfortunately, it's time to get to less enthusiastic news. I'm going to be doing another little spoiler cast for a comic book show that's had its season finale and one that I actually have liked for the most part up until this moment. So I'll be putting in the description a time code so that you can skip forward if you haven't seen the show or that you don't want to be spoiled if it ever does come up that you do want to see it in the future. The show is going to be iZombie and it's going to be starting right now. Alright, so like I said previous episodes, I really enjoy iZombie. I think it's one of the CW's best comic shows, which isn't a high bar, but it's usually been amended by, but it's still pretty good on its own right. But unfortunately, this season finale and me looking back on this season as a whole, I can no longer really say that. It's probably gotten as bad as maybe the most middling CW plot lines or shows that they have for a few specific reasons. Now, this show, when it first started, and especially the first 2 seasons and a little bit of the third, which was still pretty good in my eyes, it just wasn't as good, is that it had such clever and smart character writing, and the way that the plots unfolded was engaging, and it really did follow through on certain aspects that the CW usually glosses over, like stakes and villains and antagonists as a whole that really did feel like natural elements of the story and not just something that was pulled out of their ass or things that were just made up on the fly just to have drama or force stakes, as it were. What makes this season so different, though, is that it forgets to do any of that and just goes for the most low-hanging fruit to have stakes and drama at the expense of already established intuition and knowledge that the characters have acquired in their character development and overall growth throughout the series. Which is a shame because it really devalues a lot of those interesting questions that the show used to bring up and used to have their characters face. The most important being, how do you deal with being a zombie? And what's hammered through the first seasons, 1 and 2, is that being a zombie isn't good. It's a horrible curse to put on someone. And the implications of that and how the characters who are zombies deal with that and whether or not to do anything with that if they could comes up so many times, and it's always just been used as a way to really hammer home that the characters have this immense level of pathos to them as they struggle to combat these feelings and these questions about their existence and how they fit in with society and what the limits of their abilities can be or should be as an impact on civilization and on their loved ones. This season just throws that all out and says being a zombie is the best thing and you gotta just do whatever you can to turn more people into zombies and be a folk hero like fucking Paul Bunyan, you know? It's ridiculous. It goes around itself to say that making zombies and turning people into zombies is the only real answer to being sick or to having a sort of fatal illness, which they could have done. They could have tackled these questions in the same way that the first couple seasons did and have these characters wrestle with them. But no, every character, not even the main characters, even the side characters as well, just completely fall in line and starts stating that, no, I'm all for this. I'm all for turning people into zombies to, give them more life as a zombie, despite the fact that saying being a zombie is worse than being dead. You have one main character, his revelation at the end of the season is that, no, I don't want to be a zombie. Then have all these different perceptions of the world that forced on me, or have to deal with that, which is apparently a lot less enjoyable than just being a human being. So really, you have this entire oh, she's a hero, or they're heroes, they're folk heroes type thing about characters who are condemning these people, who, however sick may be, to a really painful and horrifying existence. But don't worry, all those questions are simplified and dumbed down, and now it's a good thing. We're never going to confront this at all. And yet, okay, I could forgive that. Because tastes change, opinions change, people got used to things. But they doubled down on the idiocy and the aggravation by having this whole subplot that the characters are trapped in a zombie city. And the fact that there's limited brain supply available to any of the zombies in the city. So the fact that making more zombies lessens that brain supply is an actual question they bring up every single episode. It's never forgotten that more zombies equals more starving people because less brains overall. Making zombies is considered a capital offense in this zombie city. The so-called heroes know about this. They never forget about it. But do they ever talk about it? Do they ever consider the ramifications of what they're doing in relation to this? Never. They never think about it. They just don't. And at the end of the season, they're like, who cares? Heroes, we're heroes. We're inspirations for turning people into zombies and making sure that more people starve to death. They're actual side characters who face this question of starving to death throughout the season. And yet, it just sort of fobbed off. And the leader of the zombie city, who is in the antagonist role and who wants to pretty much execute the people who are creating these zombies as this sort of kind of underground railroad type thing. He is pretty much just pushed into the villain role, mainly because he's doing this. No, he has to make the hard decisions about making sure people have enough to eat, which is already severely below what is necessary, what is needed. That it just becomes ridiculous that they want us to side against the person who's actually trying to pull the tide back from complete destruction and starvation and widespread discomfort of living. And the heroes don't care about that. It's hard to really be sympathetic to them. And so it just really does sink a lot more down my ranking for that. And it is such a shame for what used to be such a well-written show. So it really has fallen for grace. And I don't know if I'm even going to see the last season, because this season really didn't pull itself back from the brink. It sort of just jumped over the cliff in its simplicity, in its dumbed down nature, and in its refusal to do anything interesting or emotionally complex or engaging like the first couple of seasons had. And that's just ridiculous. It's just when nothing on the creative side has really shifted or been changed at all. It's much like the Youngblood situation I mentioned a couple episodes back, where the creative team is the same, but for some reason they seem to have forgotten exactly how to write or be interesting or enjoyable in the least. So I guess that's it for iZombie. Before we move on into questions, though, I completely forgot Bendis' Man of Steel. I really didn't like this. I thought that it had some moments, but they had so much, it felt like a montage of gimme moments. Like, oh yeah, people are going to like this because it's so expected that people would like the Superman. So having so many of these in a row felt very cheap and orchestrated and not very natural. So that decreased my enjoyment of things that should have been interesting and very lighthearted and fun. But then you have just the most generic villain of all time, who I don't understand why they would put this character at the forefront and at the center of this status quo shift. The first picture, like, oh, Krypton must be cleansed, we must purge. And then you remember that Bendis has said that he wants to bring Superman back to his Jewish roots. So you have a villain saying that a race that Superman belongs to must be purged and cleansed from the universe. And you realize, oh, Bendis, why? Why are you going this way? You're not making that analogy, right? That would be horrible and really tone deaf. But then you remember that it's Bendis. So, of course, it's going to go that way, right? So, I don't recommend it at all. It just feels hollow. Anyway, let's move on to listener questions, which we have a lot of right now, and I am excited to get into any of them. Our first question comes from Eggmath, and his is One existing IP I would love to see a comic for, and it comes with the addendum it can't be a franchise or property that has already had a comic before. So, thank you. That makes it incredibly hard. But the answer has to be Sky Captain and the World Tomorrow. You remember that movie with Jude Law and Gwyneth Paltrow and Giovanni Ribisi that no one saw and was a huge box office bomb that it ruined the career of the director who spent ages creating a whole new software so that movies could look like old pulp inspired visually? Yeah, that movie. I would want it to be a comic. I don't know. That movie had a lot of potential. It's not good, and it certainly is incredibly boring in a lot of places. But if I'm limited to a IP that has never had a comic, I would definitely pick Sky Captain in the World Tomorrow. You have Sky Captain, you have the Flying Legion, you have Angelina Jolie's Airship Legion as well. It's insane. There's so much you can do with that when you harken back to old pulp stories and serials and wartime stories as a whole. It's not the most interesting concept or premise, but it's definitely something you can mine a bunch of stories from, like even if you're doing throwbacks. So I would love to see Matt Wagner on it. I think that his tenacity in genre with things like Grendel and Mage itself really do harken to this entire conceit. He did a wonderful crossover between Grendel and The Shadow, which I recommend to anybody. It is such a wonderful miniseries. It's probably one of his best works in my eyes, especially with Grendel. If you love Grendel and you've never read this, then you need to. If you love throwbacks to old pulpy stories, then definitely you need to check it out. It is a complete delight. I don't think it's collected in the Grendel omnibuses, so if you have those, then you definitely need to pick up the trade for this one. So yeah, I think he would do a really good job. Honestly, I would have liked to see someone take another crack at Sky Captain. First movie was a bit of a dud, but it holds a little special place in my heart. I saw it at a time where this kind of movie was incredibly interesting to me, and it definitely shaped my love of old pulpy stories quite a bit. Alright, so our second question is from Moon at GUVATM, and their question is, what are my favorite horror comics and which comic has actually spooked me the most? Alright, so this is going to be a hard question to answer because as a rule and as common knowledge, comics aren't really the most effective mediums to do a scary story in. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. There just seems to be this large consensus that horror comics aren't ever actually that scary. I don't know if it's something that comes from the art not executing things well or portraying things well, our own perceptions about comics and how that filters these scares when we read them. But there's definitely a sidestep down from horror comics in terms of just the general horror universe. And that's a shame. And so this is a kind of a hard question because it really does make me have to think about it quite a bit. And the answer I come up with is there are some effectively creepy and unnerving comics that I've read. And I think that's the best you can get with in terms of just horror comics. That's the best you can get. Unnerving, just disturbing, and just really uncomfortable. And probably the preeminent example of this would be Strange Embrace by David Hine. It is definitely one of the horror comics that just ticks off every single last thing I just mentioned. It's disturbing, it's unnerving, it's uncomfortable, and it is just a grueling experience to read in the best way. These are all in the best of ways because that's what you want from a horror comic. You want something that is going to really spook you and scare you a bit. And so this comes the closest to that I think a comic can, or at least in a recent comic can. The only real faults with it that I can think of is that the bookends of this story aren't really that interesting. It's pretty silly, the bookends, the way that the framing device of this story works. The main story is one of the most gnarly things I ever read, and that's no surprise coming from David Hine, who does write a lot of horror comics. This is probably his best one. I don't really like much of his other works, though. But in terms of just my general favorite horror comics, I would have to say that things like Providence, I really enjoyed. I think that captured a lot of the isolated and truly Lovecraftian atmosphere, and Burroughs' art completely understanding what it would be to show things as opposed to what isn't shown and which is effective at which point. So that was definitely one of my favorite horror comics of all time as well. And if I had to really think of a third one, it would be something that just doesn't reach the quality of those two. If you have a favorite horror comic, then please let me know. I would definitely love to seek out more, but those two, Strange Embrace and Providence, are at the top of my list. Our next question comes from Sunglass Pre, and her question is, what is one comic resurrection that you would want to undo? I.e., what character should have stayed dead? And I'm going to play a little bit fast and loose with this one and say the entire Ultimate Universe should have stayed dead. I know that Bendis brought it back, but in all honesty, it died the death it probably deserved by the end. It had lost all energy. It had lost all creators putting anything on it. It had lost all sense, all plots, all just enthusiastic structure that a lot of the early Ultimate stuff is well known for, just going completely balls to the wall for it. And whichever one of these that it had gotten since the heyday had passed, it took to task, really actively felt like they were trying to stamp that out. It's not like there's anyone who's going to want to do anything with it other than just people who are assigned to it or who have the most bottom barrel ideas. I mean, if it ends up being great, then so be it, but it's over and dead and it lasted a long time and there's no need to have brought it back. Next up is Medea, and their question is, what is the best graphic novel I've read? And the answer to that is going to seem like a bit of a cheat, but I'm going to have to say A Contract with God is one of the actual graphic novels. It is one of those preeminent examples of the graphic novel as coined and as executed. It works and is out as simply one whole work. And it is such an engaging story, and it really shows just why Will Eisner is so well regarded and such an iconic name in comics. It's definitely great. I know that there's other ones that I probably could choose, but I'm going on the metric of something that exists solely as its own component. So no Watchmen and no Brooklyn Dreams and so on. Contract of God is just so good and do continue to completely blow me away every time I read it. Medea also has another question, however, about what is my favorite artist for the style and what is my favorite artist for the storytelling chops, which is honestly something I've never thought about. So this is a fantastic question because it really pushes me to go outside my box and think hard about why do I read things that I do. I would have to say my favorite artist for the style would have to be Keith Giffen. I can read a page of one of his comics and just love how everything is done. Some of the original Ambush Bug stuff to even some of the newer Ambush Bug stuff, they just really pop up the page. I love how jagged and completely carefree some of these works can be. You can accuse some of his later stuff of being quite regimented between panels, like 6 per page and in columns of 2. And I don't know, it's just something about it that really just makes me enjoy a lot of the humor and a lot of the witty writing that usually accompanies it a lot more than, say, some of his later work, like on OMAC, which I enjoy a lot. I love his run with Dan DiDio on OMAC, but it just doesn't have that same sort of wiriness to it. But it's along the same lines of why I enjoy an artist like Kevin O'Neill. Definitely those two, and luminaries like Alex Raymond for his Flash Gordon Sunday strip run. Completely beautiful work there as well. But in terms of artists for storytelling, I had to go with Kirby. I know it's an easy choice, but even though I enjoy and really praise the Fourfold Saga, those stories would not be what they are without Kirby's visual impact and flair. His writing, I think, really does strike a great mood, but the actual work put in by the visual side by itself, honestly, adds much more than anything else could have. Orion's pain, Highfather's complete indecision about where his life is leading, all these little things, all these little touches, and they add an incalculable amount of gravitas to the entire thing. On the art side, there's so much you can just love completely 100% on its own, divorced from the writing. And also I have to mention Jason Burrows, like I mentioned, is like the only artist that really got how to translate from words to actual visual medium and Lovecraftian atmosphere. So yeah, he goes up there as well. He did a great job on Providence. And he is definitely one of my favorite artists simply for that. And definitely within storytelling. The way he pulled off a lot of those sequences that really just hammered in what craftsmanship really is onto that series. My last question comes from the Ivanhoe. And their question is, what are my honest thoughts on the Electric Superman? And to be honest, I just love the entire history behind it. I think it comes from such a genuinely funny and cheesy place that you have people who worked on it, their editorial even, who all pretty much said that they were big fans of the original Silver Age imaginary story about Superman Red and Superman Blue, and they really wanted to do a version for it in the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths hubbub. Like, we have to make sure that we do a version of this so that somehow it exists within our cosmology, that this story, we like it so much that we have to make sure that it doesn't fade away. And by God, they pulled it off. Superman Blue, or Electric Blue Superman, or Electric Superman, is no doubt a lot more memorable than the original Superman Red and Superman Blue. So they definitely made their mark. They definitely succeeded in taking one of their favorite stories, bringing it into their era, and possibly making it one of the most immortal Superman story arcs of all time. Something that when you start digging into Superman's mythology and his history, you're going to stumble upon, you're going to see, and you'd be like, what the hell happened there? So I think that conceptually, it was pretty fun. And that with its background, it just becomes something that I really like to think about. It was definitely a mark of its time. It's not one of my favorite Superman story arcs or status quos, but I think that people who would go out of their way to call it bad just are missing the forest for the trees a little bit. And that's it for questions. But unsurprisingly, it seems that I have missed out on an entirely different, huge comic release this week. Doomsday Clock number 5. And along with Man of Steel number 1, it seems that I definitely enjoyed a lot more of the third stringer comics this week than any of the bigger, more touted releases. Although with Doomsday Clock, I definitely enjoyed it a whole hell of a lot more than Man of Steel number 1. If I had to say any negatives about Doomsday Clock as a whole, especially this issue, is that what Jeff Johns seems to have primarily taken away from Watchmen is that you need puns, you need wordplay, because there are dozens per page in this series and in this issue that it boggles the mind. So Jeff Johns is definitely putting in some work and a whole hell lot of effort in that work, for sure. The issue itself, though, I enjoyed it. I am enjoying the series. It's okay. It's not the best series. It's not something that I'm ecstatic about, but it's fine. It's some pages, some sequences are good. Gary Frank's art is amazing on it, and he's definitely also putting in a hell of a lot of time making sure that it's perfect. So honestly, there's not much more I can say about that than that. Plot-wise, this issue definitely springs forward almost all the subplots leaps and bounds. There was this review I saw the other day. The headline was, remember when this series had a plot? I'm like, are you kidding? This 5th issue is all about the plot. It's definitely not taking any time out to remind us that there was no plot or to drag things out. So this issue definitely pulls a few tricks from under its hat. And we get stuff like the Johnny Thunder plot and the Legion of Superheroes plot get a lot of focus and more attention. So that's great. This is one huge moment that I won't spoil, but you already probably heard of it, that blew me away a bit and definitely made me gasp and say, oh shit. So that was really fun to experience. So yeah, it was okay issue. And probably the highlight though was seeing Gary Frank draw a picture of the new Superman from China, which I thought I'd never see because it looks out of sight. Although I have seen a lot more theories about Doomsday Clock right now, and I want to just get mine out there. The villain of Doomsday Clock is most likely Earthman from Jeff Johns and Gary Frank's Legion of Superheroes arc in Superman Action Comics, mainly because the modus operandi of both series so far, sowing distrust and hoaxes about superheroes and Legion of Superheroes themselves being involved, is definitely reminiscent of Earthman's whole plan in that arc. So I'm saying it, I'm calling it right now. Earthman is behind everything. Anyway, so that's it for this week. As always, Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts, comments, subjects, or questions you would like to hear on the show, please comment below on YouTube or on Castbox or even on iTunes. I'll try and find out which one is which. Or you can tweet at me directly at THE_SNICKMAN. With special thanks to at DOTEMCEE for the cover art. As always, I definitely still love it. Plus, a very special and grateful thanks to the lovely people who sent in questions. I really do think that every single one of them was fantastic. And it's great to always have things to really delve into on the show. So thank you again. And see you all next week.